Hey, FrSky people, I love you. This is Steve with FrSky North America talking today about receivers. It's confusing because there's a lot of receivers, and I wanted to make it a lot simpler for people to understand what all these different receivers do. So I created a spreadsheet towards the end of 2023, and I used all the available information that I could possibly find, and I classified them all in one spreadsheet, so it's not spread all over the internet, not spread out all over the FrSky negativesignrc.com website. And it's here. And this link is available in the description, so please feel free to share it with your friends. Let's talk about the different receivers that we have to offer. Clearly, I cannot talk about all the receivers all at once because it would take a long time. However, I did break them down into what I thought would be logical groups, and hopefully this will make it a little bit easier to comprehend and understand what they are. The thing we're going to start off with is the tandem non-stabilized receivers, and there's 5 of them. And you can see on the list here they are, everything from the TDR18 to the TDMX. And I'm just going to go down this list and kind of discuss what all these different things are, and hopefully give you some background as to why these things are important. First and foremost, I get this question asked quite a bit: what are these tandem receivers compatible with? And there's essentially 2 styles of radio. It's either the Tandem Pro, which is the X20 Pro, or tandem transmitters, which are the variations of the X18, the X20, and the XE transmitters. They are not compatible with the new twin transmitters, and they're not compatible with the older Tyrannus or Horus transmitters. They're not compatible with any other radio manufacturer's transmitters, including ones that have multi-protocol modules. So if you would like to use these receivers, you would have to use them with something that has the name Tandem in it. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. We're going to talk about the compatible bands. These tandem transmitters, the reason they got the name Tandem is because they work in tandem with each other. 2 frequencies, and they are the 2.4 gigahertz frequency and the 900 megahertz frequency. 2.4 gigahertz is the party all night kind of frequency because it works with everything. It is the friendly, works with everyone. You can fly at flying events on 2.4 gigahertz with 300 of your closest friends simultaneously, and you have plenty of bands to work with. It is a great all-around transmission frequency. The problem is that everything else in the universe also wants to use 2.4 gigahertz, and the 2.4 gigahertz band is getting polluted. Now, why it's important to RC, I know you're like, well, I'm not going to be flying by some apartment complex where there's 1,000 routers all broadcasting on Wi-Fi, but you will most likely fly somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes even the most desolate remote places have things like something that turns water on to feed cattle, or something that infrastructure related, something that will oil wells, for example, or maybe something for a sprinkler system or turn on lights. There's just a number of these things out there. If you fly by something that is close to something industrial, the big thing now is they use these 2.4 gigahertz transmission systems to transmit from one building to another, and they really want to make sure the signal gets from one building to another, and so they go well above the FCC 1 watt limit. And the problem is that these bands don't stop transmitting once they get away from the building. They keep going. And sometimes what happens is you're flying along and everything's great, and the next second you don't have your plane. And there's no worse feeling in the whole world when you realize your plane is no longer under your control and it's going down, and it's going to be expensive and it's going to be ugly, and you hope you don't hurt anybody. So what happens is, in that brief period of time when the 2.4 gigahertz is starting to fail, the receiver will instantly identify that 2.4 gigahertz is failing to provide the required number of packets it needs to maintain a flight. It instantly switches to 900 megahertz. 900 megahertz is this really wonderful band. It has a long range capabilities. It penetrates beautifully. It's just a great all around band. Unfortunately, there's not a gazillion channels like 2.4 gigahertz. But in that moment of crisis, it's there for you and it bails you out, and you'll never know about it. So that's why I love this. And, you know, when I first started with FrSky, it was like we talked about this as something that was theoretical, and I've had enough people buy these transmitters. And I've heard back from a number of these people, and they're like, oh my gosh, this stuff actually works. Like, we got hit by something. My buddy was flying 2.4 gigahertz. His plane went down. I kept flying. And yeah, these types of things happen. The 2.4 gigahertz, in my opinion, it is the very, very, very best radio link available in the market for fixed wing RC. So that's what these bands are for. When we talk about the number of PWM channels, it's pretty easy to figure out that we're talking about 18 channels, 12 channels. So people ask, where's the 8 channel? We have 10 channel in the TDR section. And so we have TDR6 and TDR10. Typically, if you want an 8 channel, you're better off with the 10 channel. We have the number of S-bus channels. Now, this is interesting, and I'm trying to explain this as best as possible. Essentially, when you're sitting behind a train where you pull up somewhere and all of a sudden the train light, the railroad crossing comes down and you're blocked, and you're like hoping like, oh, gosh, I hope it's a short train, because if it's a long train, you're going to be there for 20 minutes. Hey, you know that feeling. Well, these packets are similar to trains. The serial packets means that the transmission from the transmitter to the receiver is transmitted one packet after another. And the more packets you have is like the more cars you have, which means that it takes longer to get from point A to point B because you have to wait till the last car goes by. So by default, we have 16 channels turned on for S-Bus, and that is, even though we say we have 24 channels, by default it's 16 channels. But don't worry, we do offer 24 channels, and all you have to do is go into the RF section and change it from S-Bus 16 to S-Bus 24. So there's a little free extra information about our receivers. Over-the-air updates is something I find to be absolutely stellar amazing. You'll love this if you've ever done this before. If you've ever, back in the old days when we had a firmware update, you would have to dig your receiver out of your plane, hook it up to your transmitter, and do the update. You put the update on the transmitter, hook the receiver up, do the update. Now it's all done over the air. You put the update on your transmitter via your computer, and then you turn your transmitter on, link it to your receiver, and follow a process, and you will send the firmware update over the air to the receiver, and it gets updated, and it works beautifully. Assignable pins is something that's interesting. So there's something called pins and there's something called channels, and they're not one and the same. So pin 1 on your receiver is traditionally channel 1, but you can assign it to be channel 2, channel 5, channel 10, channel 18, channel 24, S-Bus, F-Bus, Smart Port, S-Bus out, S-Bus, and there's just a lot of different things it can be. These assignable pins work. I will say that the TDR6, you do not have the option for S-Bus in, and S-Bus out also does not work with that as well. So that means is that you would, in order to use S-Bus out, you would have to plug in this Molex connector to the side of the TDR6, and for that reason in and of itself, I recommend people spend the extra $20 and get the TDR10. You're going to be thanking me in about a year, because people buy these things like, oh, I got a 6-channel plane and I don't need to really, or like you're flying a flying wing, for example, only need 3 channels. Yeah, 6 channels fine, but then a year from now you're done with the plane. and you are moving onto another plane, and you got the 6-channel receiver, and now you're into something that needs more channels, and you don't have to deal with this anymore. TDR10 is always very useful. So when we talk about, I mentioned a lot of things like FBus and SBus in, SBus out, smart port. These are all, well, SBus in and SBus out we talked about. SBus in means that you have another receiver hooked up to your receiver, and it's also acting as a satellite. So from that satellite receiver, you use SBus out for something like a TDMX, which only has SBus out as a real viable option, or FBus. That's how you would hook this up into your TDR anywhere from 18 to 10, and you can have SBus in on those. They're all hooked up on channel, well, actually it's pin 1. I'm going to have to change this to pin 1. It's not channel 1. So what happens to channel 1 once pin 1 is used? Well, you find any available free port or pin and just change it to channel 1, and all of a sudden you get your left aileron or your ailerons back. We talked about the frequency. Now, as far as dimension and weight, I probably doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the more channels you have, the more this thing weighs and the larger the receiver is. But if you look at it, they're not remarkably larger than the TDR10. There's a size difference and a weight difference, and if you have a small plane, about the only time I would really recommend a TDR6 is if you have a really cramped fuselage where you don't have very much space, and then a TDR6 makes perfect sense. Otherwise, TDR10, stick with that. Operating voltages are all the same. They're about 3.5 volts, which means that we'll work with a 1S battery if you wanted to hook it up that way. As far as talking about operating voltage, I should just mention that we'll be talking about the connectors on the TDR18 and TDR12. These two go together. They use external batteries. These use UBECs. So on your BEC, your SBEC or UBEC, whatever one you have, usually puts out anywhere from 5 volts, which is most common. Some of the more advanced ones will go up to 8.4 volts. So a UBEC will power these receivers. Actually, a UBEC will power all these receivers, but you cannot both have a UBEC powering up this receiver and plug in your XT30 connectors with either LiPo or LiFi batteries. You can't have both at the same time. It will blow up your receiver, and you get the magic smoke show, and you're very bummed when you're spending anywhere from $105 to $35 for a new receiver. So one or the other, folks. As far as the operating current, they all are anywhere from 110 to 185 milliamps. It's just not really going to affect how long your plane battery is. I mean, it's such a small amount of power that it's not going to affect your flight times at all. One thing I did find interesting about this is that the milliamps for the TDMX is the same as the TDR18, which I find very interesting because there's a lot more going on in the TDR18. They all use these IPEX-1 connectors, and if you happen to break an antenna, we do have them for sale, and I highly recommend you get the FrSky ones and not the aftermarket ones, because the aftermarket ones might not work as well. The AN2 is this voltage measurement thing. It's essentially, it looks like a bunch of random extra wires, black and red. There's some good videos we have that will describe how to set these things up. And what they do is they measure the pack voltage for free with the receiver. You have to solder it into a battery lead or something like that, ESC. And with that, you can, in real time, get your pack voltage, and you can keep flying until you determine it's time to land your plane. The black box function is also kind of interesting in the respect that It's located in the RF section of your receiver, and what this does is it gives you some real basic stats about your flight as far as reception and also voltage and all sorts of other things. It's a nice little recap. You should go check it out at some point. It's interesting. It's there. It's free. Might as well use it. The 4 millisecond race mode is really something that isn't that big of a deal for it's a low latency race mode for people who fly race drones. We're talking about fixed wing planes, so it's there. I doubt you'll use it or necessarily care about it. Long range, all these receivers have 900 megahertz. That is a great long range FPV protocol. You can fly for miles and miles away. And as long as you have a video transmitter broadcasting back a video signal, you can figure your way how to get back home. If you have something like iNav, there's actually an OSD that comes up on this in the video feed, and it will help you figure out how to get back. It's a really neat technology. That's how I first got started with FrSky, because I started flying iNav. We talked about the XT30 dual battery ports. Only 2 of these receivers have them, the TDR18 and TDR12. Both of them take these optional switches, which are either NFC switches, which many people mistake for magnetic switches. They're not magnetic. The NFC is similar to what you use to open the door at a hotel these days. You tap it, or your credit cards, you tap to pay, that type of thing. That's an NFC, near field communication. None of these have stabilization, altitude, or inverted S ports. These 2 things come with the stabilized receivers, inverted S port, if for something that you use for a flight controller. And the instant current and continuous current are 2 different things. So only 2 of these receivers have them. And this is, I think, one of the more interesting things that I came across, because I thought that the TDR12 and the TDR18 were identical receivers, and the only thing that were different about them was the TDR18 had 6 extra channels. Nope. The TDR18 actually has an instant current, which means for momentarily it can hand out about 60 amps to all your servos. If you have a power hungry servo, it can draw momentarily up from that 60 amp pool of energy, and essentially servos max out at about 8 amps. That's what you get off these typical PWM ports. So, but if you're flying something that has a lot of power hungry servos, something like a 3-meter 50-pound turbine jet, you probably will be very interested in this, and you will want to have as much power as possible. That's why I recommend the TDR18. If you're flying something that's 2 meters or smaller, especially something that's foam or something that is, just about anything else, gliders, you don't really, well, if you're flying gliders, you're probably not going to be using either of these, but let's just say you were. 20 amps is plenty, and so really it's up to you. I would pay careful attention to this if you're flying turbine jets or really large warbirds where you have power hungry servos. You're going to want as much power as possible. However, when you start to measure the current draw on a lot of these servos, don't be surprised to see that a lot of times it's only like 4 or 5 amps. If you wanted to find out more about any of these, the links to all the manuals are right here, and there's a download page that talks about all the different, has links to the manual in there as well, and also the you can get the firmware or see what the latest firmware is for it. I've included the SKU numbers for all these different receivers, and I also included the manufacturer's suggested retail price for all these receivers. And with that in mind, You know, this, to really do justice to this, it's about a 20-minute video, and I do thank you for watching. If you have questions, please feel free to read them, leave them in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.